just a remembrance of when I was very young, and like 5, 6, 7 years old, and my I remember back to the enjoyment I had in making things, particularly graphics, painting, you know, on a little easel and that sort of thing, drawing, making colors, and that whole impulse, as I review it, when I was very young, went underground, just sort of disappeared, and because there didn't seem to be anywhere in my formal education that had a place for art, drawing, color, all the things that I started to do later. There wasn't anything in the formal education that what I would call really creative. So that when I was in grammar school, there were events along the way that were very interesting to me. I had a lot of fun doing, and one I remember was in 6th grade, my 6th grade teacher had installed big floor looms for weaving across the hall from our classroom. And when you got through with your work, you could go over there, and she taught us how to weave on these looms. And I found that very fascinating, and I really enjoyed that. And then in high school, there was a drafting class, and I think one art appreciation class for half a semester. But there wasn't anything that was in the visual arts that I was being trained for, or anything like that. It was all college preparation, and so I didn't have a sense of myself as an artist until much later. I went into this service when I was 19 as a naval aviator for 4 years, and came out when I was 23 and went back to college. And at that time, I was a physics major, but I was also not sure where I was headed. And I took a couple art courses at the same time, which interestingly enough, people talked about. They thought it was rather strange that a physics major was taking art courses too. And I think that says something about my nature. Is I've never seen any reason to set up barriers and define myself in one category. And I think that shows in my work and life. But so I took a couple art courses, and I do remember at that time the art instructor at Occidental College, he said, look into that field there, that field of grass, and what do you see? And I forgot whether it was a class discussion or whether I said, well, I see green. And he says, well, look more closely. There's a lot of colors in there. And I started looking at it, the field, and I noticed that there was a wide range of color. And I was kind of surprised at how rich it was in color. It wasn't just green, one green. It was reds and browns and purples and blues, and the full spectrum was there if you looked. And it was a little minor revelation to me. And I found that I really enjoyed these few classes I was taking. It didn't seem, in my conditioning, it didn't seem quite real that you could just go out and sit and paint somewhere. And that's what we were doing, going out onto locations and making watercolor paintings. And but I was looking at things more carefully with an artist's eye for the first time. And somehow I, about that time, decided that I wasn't cut out to be a physicist or an engineer or an academic in that direction, and that I needed to do something that included the arts or more creative work. And at the time, I didn't realize you could be creative as a physicist or in any field, but there wasn't any real encouragement or instruction along those ways. So on my own, I decided to change my direction and go into landscape architecture. And I thought, well, I can combine my growing interest in the aesthetics and creativity with the plants, which I liked, and the more ordered world of architecture. And I had some abilities there, so I went off in that direction. And by the time I got through with my studies in landscape architecture, I got a professional degree, 5-year degree in landscape architecture. I was back in North Carolina finishing up at the School of Design, North Carolina State University. And there I got introduced to studio painting. And there were 2 or 3 really very fine artists there, a couple who had been acknowledged as in the art world. And I was painting in this studio, and I really liked it. And the school was getting, the regular school, I was getting a little tired of that. And I do remember getting encouragement by this a couple very fine painters there, and I took that encouragement very much to heart. And I do remember the day I went to, it was a Sunday, and I went back to the school to finish up my final project in landscape architecture. It's a large project with a lot of drawing and design and so on, and a presentation drawing, or more than a drawing, a series of them. And it was going to be my final project, and I needed to get it done, and time was close to present it. And I remember walking up the stairs to a breezeway that connected the 2 buildings there. And then to the right was the studio for the design studio. It took a hold of me and turned me left to the painting studio. And I didn't, I went and painted all afternoon, and by myself, and it was, I really loved it. And I didn't ever finish my architectural project, although I did graduate with honors, but I guess it was already done. But so I started teaching there, and I had to make a decision the next year whether to stay as a teacher in a design school or go work for a very fine design firm, or whatever. I had to make some decision about that. My children, first child was born. My daughter Heidi was born by then, and I believe, yeah, my wife at the time was pregnant with the second child, and I decided that what I really wanted to do, and it was a decision of the heart, was to leave the more formal world, professional world of teaching and design offices and coats and ties and all that kind of stuff. And I wanted to return to my home in California, where I spent most of my life. I grew up in Southern California, and particularly along the coast. I've spent a lot of time along the California coast, growing up became a surfer back in the early 50s, and I felt most at home here in this land, and I wanted my children to grow up in a kind of California coastal environment, as free as possible, barefoot. That's the way I saw it. So abandon these professions that I was ready to be included in, and we came out here, arrived in Santa Cruz in a Volkswagen bus in 1964. So you ask about the beginnings of my art. It's somewhere back in there, a gradually kind of person than a engineer or a professional office kind of person. And of course, this didn't guarantee any sort of livelihood exactly, and but my sense of it, it was, and it still is, in a really fundamental way, that if one follows one's calling or heart, that the economics will follow along, and it may not be a lot, but somehow you trust that, and somehow you work it out along the way. Things happen that couldn't have happened if you hadn't made that decision. So that's I sort of had a lot of faith. It would be the way to put it, in my deeper movements that I was uncovering at that time, my middle 20s, late 20s. The painting, and I somehow identified myself more as a painter. I was pretty good at drawing, but I didn't know much. I had a lot of, well, not a lot, but I had some art history courses along the way in college, and had been shown the conventional Western education about art, its place, but I didn't really connect too much with that. It didn't inspire me, and I just wasn't ready to hear it or study that formally. And so when I started manifesting these inclinations to be a painter, as I identified myself, I didn't really know what I was doing. It was kind of wide open, and I didn't say, well, I've got to learn this and this and this and this before I can become a painter. It wasn't an academic approach at all. It was a very much inner movement, inner drive, a sense that was one can't completely explain. So I say it's like poetry. And so I began, I think, even though I took a few painting classes, a couple at Occidental College when I got out of the service, and they were maybe evidence of this movement. I think at North Carolina was where I really I felt something strong as a painter in a studio painting. And we had access to real that didn't cost hardly anything. Had wonderful studios, and paint was real cheap, oil paint and canvas and all that, and so I just took off, and right away I was painting as an abstract expressionist, and I didn't really know what I was doing, but it somehow what came out got acknowledged as something by these a couple of the artists there, the painters, who were recognized as even up in New York as good painters. So they said they'd shake their heads and say, "Yeah, you got something going." And I don't know if they knew what it was or I knew what it was, but I just kept on going. And then one of my paintings got chosen to go to a state show at the museum, and I don't know why, but there it was. And so in the midst of all that, I found myself almost immediately getting very interested in color, and I came to call it the colorness of color, essence of color. But I was really fascinated or drawn toward what color was about, and so I started. Well, abstract expressionist is very textural. You're putting paint this way, that way, and you get these textures and movements, and it's a very lively, usually a very lively surface, and I found myself almost immediately decreasing the contrast, dark and light contrast between colors. As I looked at the colors, I wanted the color, the colorness of it to define the area of color, and not it's just because it was darker or lighter than an adjacent area. So I began to reduce the dark light contrast, and at the same time I was introduced to Joseph Alber's theories of color and others, and that was fascinating to me, how to learn about color. The Munsell system and Albers were two strong influences, and it led me very quickly to eliminate dark light contrast and deal with creating my images with only the hue differences and saturation, the degree of saturation of a hue, those two dimensions of color, and holding the dark and light aspect of color at one level, sometimes through the whole painting. So that was kind of where I was going, and when I left North Carolina, I had definitely was working as a non-objective painter in an abstract way, and still didn't know quite what I was doing, but I certainly had the feelings of continuing on in that journey. Okay.
Switch questions. I'm going to switch camera angle too. I've been zooming in and out, changing shots that way, but let's change position a bit. I'm going to come in slightly to this side. I want to go over there's a 180-degree line. And if I go over there, screen direction changes. So this will be more straight on.
Okay.
And this will be close. So you look directly into camera. This is hopefully...
How much can I move? Is it very much? A little bit?
Just a little, because I'm going to go in tight. One drama here, hopefully. That we're... Okay. question is, you raised a family, you consider yourself an artist. How did you do it? How did you make money?
The question's been asked about money, and my approach to this money issue is that one looks for the deeper movement in oneself, the spirit of.
Hold on, we're getting wind now.
Yeah.
See if we have windscreen. I try to avoid using the windscreen if I don't need it, but if I need it, I need it.
Okay. It's a rather it's interesting that the question's asked now in the beginning, because my approach is that one follows one's heart, the spirit of things first, and then the different parts of the life manifest, and one part of that is the economic part. But I found myself, and still do, staying open to a larger impulse, or you might say a spiritual impulse, if you like, to an unknown place, and then allowing the movement to happen out of that. Requires a lot of trust and and faith that something will develop, and not only something of a creative nature, a painting or a building, or helping someone, or whatever it is, but somewhere in that manifestation will be the economics will come together. So I have tended not to set up an economic framework in the beginning, but to see it as part of a larger movement. And I know that that's counter to maybe the primary way our particular culture operates, since it's basically a mercantile culture that we live in here. That's the kind of people who establish this culture here on this land. And but it just isn't the way that my mind works. So it's not a matter of being against money, so per se, but it's just seeing it as part of the whole package of the manifestation. It's coming into focus. So to me, it's important to remain as open as I can, and then through some sort of impulse or inspiration, you might say, or idea, begin to allow that seed, so to speak, to begin to grow. And seeds grow, they start in the darkness, but they have the right conditions. So I think I'm an advocate for right conditions, the environment being right for for creativity to grow, and that means a lot of preparation, and that means an attitude that allows that to happen. So the money comes out of that seed too, and but as far as for me, the money is just a necessary for a medium of exchange. I don't have any sense of accumulating it. It just as long as a little bit flows, and it's a medium of exchange. That's the way we are here in this culture. You get some money and you buy something, and but as far as accumulating the money, I don't have any interest in that. For me, the important thing is time. And
I'm going to interrupt. I'm sorry.
yeah.
I guess I didn't phrase my question correctly. Maybe philosophically,
Mm.
you covered the idea of how you approach money. It's something that comes along. When it comes along, you don't worry too much about it. But I'm asking more just in terms of, in a practical sense, what did you do?
Yeah.
Did you sell paintings or regular, or did you do architectural work? I just want to get
Yeah,
a
I'm
brief
getting to that.
picture.
Yeah. Okay. So out of that might say philosophy, there have been a number of ways that I've put together the economics. When I painted, since this focus here is on my painting, I never thought of my painting as a money maker. In other words, I made the paintings, and then if they happened to be sold or they had gained some value, fine. But that's a secondary to the making of them, the creation of them. So my mind has never been in a place where I say, well, I'll make a painting like this because somehow it'll make money, or somebody says they'll give me money if I paint in a certain way, or anything like that. So the paintings came out of a place that that was my personal artistic spirit, and then there they were. And then the followed was sometimes I would sell a painting. As I went a little further along, I had some shows, and but there was never enough to take care of all the all the expenses. I doubt whether over my lifetime, whether my sales of my paintings have maybe equaled the cost of making them, storing them, studios, materials, all that. So I'm not sure. I've never figured that out. But so that was. But there was occasionally a little money coming in, and then the other was my design work. I'm a landscape architect and architect, although I've never attained the license, so I can't really call myself either of those. I have to say landscape designer and I think building designer. And so in those fields, I've made a living over the years, off and on. And then I did a little teaching at 2 or 3 different universities, not as a regular tenured teacher, but I would go in and teach for a year, and or part-time. Or there was a few summers I taught. I think about 3 different summers I taught various classes. And so that was another way of getting a little bit of money. And then I've done some, I've done actually some laboring in landscape work. When I didn't have any work and I didn't have much money, and I went out and actually dug trenches and moved rocks and so on too. Done that kind of work. Not a lot of it, but off and on over the years. Did some of that. I wasn't alone. I had my companion, a wife, my first wife, and then and once the children were of age, or all in school and well along, she began to work again. And so, and then there was occasional uh, little help from the family, you know. I mean, a nice, generous gift, or occasionally from the family. So, but not enough to as an ongoing thing, you know. It just helped out now and then. So then the other part of that answer is that as I became, I went through quite an education, social education, how the world works, what was going on. I started paying attention, becoming more aware of what was going on politically, socially, in the late 50s into the 60s, and that led to some a very much against the Vietnam War, and I did some protest at that time, and then also became more and more aware of how wasteful we are in this modern culture here. And I had studied ecology in school, and I started to put it all together. And I guess that book by Shoemaker, you know, Small is Beautiful, kind of is a motto that I started to embrace. The simpler living, maybe put it that way. I decided somewhere around, I would imagine the 60s and the 70s and there, that the way that I was going to live would be as simple as possible, without, you know, without cutting everything off, and but a very non-acquisitive, from the point of view of property kind of life, a healthy life where I ate good food, good healthy food, and took care of my body, and so that I wouldn't get sick. And that meant eating, you know, eating not so much, and eating good food, and getting proper exercise, and so I took care of that part of it, and then just said in a kind of inner way that I just wasn't going to buy into the expensive living and acquisition of things, and simple living, basically. So I've lived pretty much that way since I've been most of my adult life, and continue to live simply. And what it's done, or the other side of that, is that I've had time, because I haven't spent time trying to acquire monetary wealth, that I've been able to have a lot of time to consider and work in a creative way, whether it be on in my painting or architectural projects or writing or poetry. I've had the time to do that because I just live in a you know, minimal way economically, and that's I guess that's what has to happen. You know, people say, well, what you got to do first is you build up a big resource of reservoir of money, then you can go do these things you want to do. And well, I know a lot of people in my life who have gone down that road, and they just turn into something else. They just don't do the things that they were going to do, their creative life. And I don't judge it. Just if you're gonna be a painter, then you got to paint. You know, you got to do it. And it's very difficult to, at least for me, to to be in that state of mind and to have all the concerns that and the complications that are required in, say, a high-tech, ambitious life where one is trying to acquire things, and so it seems to take all your energy, and you really don't have the kind of energy available for going in deep into your into one's creative life. So at least for me, that's that way. And so I've done all those different things, but I think that maybe by following that path, I discovered this simpler way of living, and it's more peaceful. It's more settled inside, less anxious, and healthier. And overall, I think that it can be a contribution to our culture. You know, being that way rather than being a drain on the community by one's taking away, you know, with one's selfish behavior. So anyway, that's been the general drift of my approach, and sometimes it's been very difficult because I've had no money,